Welcome to Thriving in the Game, a podcast dedicated to exploring what Black women need to navigate the corporate world of technology, offering insights, strategies, and personal stories that will affirm, validate, and encourage you on your journey up the corporate ladder. I'm your host, Alicia. Join me as we learn how to thrive together. Now, if I were to ask you, what are the values that guide your life and your career? Could you name them? Just give me your top 3. Before this episode, I probably would have rattled off something like growth, work-life balance, and maybe flexibility. Maybe even something intrinsic like loyalty, respect, or integrity. But while these types of values definitely help to shape your career experience, I found that when it comes to defining your career, you have to dig a lot deeper when it comes to your values. Think about it. Could the values you're thinking of right now, could they help you drive your career forward with intentional, meaningful action? Could they help lay the foundation for your career brand? Could they help you assess when an organization is right for you? And ultimately, when you experience challenges, could they help you identify when it's an opportunity to learn and grow versus a time to go? If not, listen up and bring a shovel. We're about to dig deep into it. I had an opportunity to sit down with Kiran Yoliswa. Our initial introduction came through Emerging Voices. Hiwa Tegatana is the plug, but it was in episode 2 or Lost of Kiran's podcast, The Possibility Pattern, that I knew she would be the voice you needed to hear. Kiran is the founder of Sanduka, a one-on-one coaching practice that helps individuals clarify, unblock, and create purposeful and abundant careers. Her passion is creating transformative, community-centered spaces for Black and brown women. I hope that you enjoy our exploration of some of the ways early career Black women can begin to identify their values, how to leverage them in their career decisions, and how to protect them within the workplace. Well, Kiran, tell us a little bit about yourself, and I will definitely add in a not-so-shameless plug for the Possibility Pattern.
So I am an integrative change coach, and I specialize in helping people who want to make changes in their career. So whether that's about trying to change into a completely different career or just trying to make changes within the career that they're in, maybe they want to go for a promotion or they just want to just navigate themselves differently within their career. It's something that I've been doing for the past few years. And so as part of that, I created the Possibility Pattern, which is essentially the framework that I use to coach people through, and decided that I wanted to share more about this and these lessons. So I made a podcast about it, basically walking people through each stage so that they can understand what's happening at different points and what you can do. Because I think a big challenge that people can often have is feeling stuck, but not knowing where they are and therefore not knowing what to do next. So I really wanted to create a resource for people to be able to do that. And essentially like those lessons, it comes from the work I've done with clients, but also from my career so far. So I was working in tech, and then before that, I have worked at an investment fund, have been an entrepreneur, have worked in an NGO. So I feel like I've had a pretty well-rounded career experience, so it can relate to lots of different situations that people might be going through. So yeah, it's really just like hard-earned lessons from my career and then also from my clients.
I think what's inspiring about that is there has to be a foundation that carries you through each of those different worlds. You have to have a set of values and definitely some boundaries that help you align with the right organizations. And so with today's topic, as we expound upon that, how would you define values, and how does a young woman early in her career really start to identify them and bring those into the workplace?
So the way that I think about values, the most like functional way that I think about it is that it's a mental model. It's a way of just like organizing your thoughts, organizing your behaviors. Often people can talk about values maybe from a morality perspective, but if I'm thinking about it in terms of career and just trying to be as practical as possible, I think about it like a mental model. And so what that means is just like the values are the categories, right? So what are the categories with which I'm organizing my life? It's actually, it sounds like a tangent, but I recently reorganized my pantry and was reading about the best way to do that. And they were like, you have to put it into zones. And it's like, this is for the grain zone and the snacks and stuff like that. And that's how I think about it, like categories of thoughts. So that's one level. At a deeper second level is that values are also ways that our brain categorizes information. So at any given time, we're always receiving just like a ton of information. But in any present moment, we are only actually aware of a very small amount of that information. And how our brain sorts out what we should pay attention to and what we're just filtering out is based on our values. Actually, from a neuroscience perspective, the term is called value tagging. And this is like a very real systematic way that our brain essentially like attributes labels and categories to information and basically sort out that information so that we understand like what is it that we're paying attention to and not those categories that determine our thoughts and therefore our behavior and therefore our actions and results that we are seeing in our lives.
When we look at establishing our values, and I like the way you frame it, it's more of a mental model. How do they start to define their mental model?
So I think the first thing around establishing your values, you have values already. So even like what I was saying about our brain's value tagging, that's happening without you doing any conscious work. So even if you think, I don't think I have values yet, how do I decide what my values are? You already have values that are playing as a script in your brain, in your mind. So the first question is, what are the values that I'm living by? Because if you haven't consciously chosen what you want those values to be, best believe you have subconsciously chosen something passively. And there's a value script that's running. You just don't know what it is yet. So I think in terms of establishing it, I think that first step is increasing your awareness around what are the values that I'm currently living out. And then you can decide, okay, when I look at that, how do I feel about that? Does that feel aligned with the kind of life I want to live? Does that feel aligned with my priorities moving forward? Do I feel good about that? What do I want to change? And you can make some decisions and decide on your priorities. And so what I encourage people to do when you're thinking about how do you raise your awareness about your current values, I think two things that are really good signifiers of that is our time and our money. So the first one is look at how you've been spending your time. So I recommend people look back at the past month, past couple of months, and just see what are you committing your time to? Are you, for example, saying that you are going to go to the gym, but actually you don't end up going? Are you spending a lot of time with your friends instead of your family? Are you spending a lot of time doing certain activities over others? You'll see what you are subconsciously valuing because your behavior is going there. Like I was saying about the value tagging, our behavior comes from our thoughts, which comes from our value scripts. And then the other piece is around money. This is one of the things that I try and do regularly is look at where I'm spending money. You can very easily think like, oh, you know what, I really value certain things. And then you look at like how you've been spending your money and you realize, oh, you've been actually spending your money on very different things. So for example, I remember I did this a couple of years ago. And if you'd asked me beforehand, I would have told you, oh, I'm the kind of person who values spending my money on quality and experiences and that kind of stuff. But when I looked back at all of my spending from the year before and realized that I think it ended up being like my third biggest expense after like my housing costs, like my mortgage and savings and investments, my third biggest expense was eating out. And I was shocked. I was like, wow, this is not in alignment because it wasn't eating out in like nice restaurants with a really creative menu where I'm excited about it. It was like takeaway and lunch at work. Do you know what I mean? Like convenience takeout. And that is not one of my values. That is not how I want to live my life. And yet the evidence shows that is a top value for me in terms of my behavior. So that was an opportunity for me to decide, okay, I want to reprioritize and choose something different moving forward. So yeah, I think looking at how you're spending your time and looking at how you're spending your money can give you a lot of insight into your current behaviors. And your relationships will also show up in those two things because we invest in our relationships through our time and through our money. Another thing that I recommend people to do is an exercise called The Yearning Octopus by this writer called Tim Urban. I referenced this on my podcast as well, but I like it because it's a good visual thing to respond to. It's essentially like an octopus, just in all the different tentacles. There's different kinds of themes of our lives. There's social, personal, security, those kinds of things. So being able to look at something and respond and see what it is that shows up for you, I find that people find it really powerful because sometimes it's difficult to just ask yourself the question around, what do I value? Whereas I've noticed that what will often happen, people will look at it and think, oh, I can see how I thought I was really prioritizing my salary because of security, but really it's because of status. And that comes from the personal side. Like it makes me feel good in terms of my personal identity. And so just being able to dig deeper and interrogate at different levels, the decisions that you've been making over time, So if you're thinking specifically about career, what I do with my clients is I say, let's look at the past 10 years of your career. And if you're 3 to 5 years into your career, I would still think about this in terms of maybe school and college and your early career. So just thinking, why did you choose the college you went to? Why did you choose the subjects that you did, your clubs or associations and that kind of stuff? Why did you make the key choices that you made? How I do it with people who have a bit more career experience is we look at the 10 years. What were the highs of your career so far, like your big inflection points and then the big lows, and just try and understand what was it underneath these choice points. And again, you'll start to notice a pattern in terms of themes, and you'll start to realize, oh, I chose that because of my beliefs around this, or I wanted to make an impact, or it was really about security, freedom, or whatever. You can start to tease out what those things are. And then you can start to shortlist like 4 to 5 different areas that you can see that you've been really investing in over this period of time.
I think doing this at a younger age, it develops your self-awareness, not from a place of judgment. It's just looking at, like you said, your mental model and then examining your time and money. And then it just helps you make decisions. So if you're starting to look at job searching, or if you're looking at another department within your current company, you can start to determine what's important. Maybe right now in this season, it is I want to create more security. I want to create more savings. Or maybe it is a little bit of status right now, right? But later, the other thing is understanding that it may start to change as you bring in a partner and children and things like that.
Absolutely. And I think that, like you were saying, having that self-awareness, it just allows you to make better decisions sooner. And something that I notice with people is if you are not clear on what these things are, you can subconsciously be trying to go for opportunities or challenge yourself in particular ways that are not necessarily aligned with your values. And you can create frustration and suffering for yourself. I'll give you an example. My cousin is a software engineer and he was interviewing for this company and was really frustrated by the interview process. He was telling me all the things that he was annoyed by. And when we got to the bottom of it, as an engineer, one of his core values is functionality, whereas this company, their core first value is beautiful design. Functionality comes second. That is in complete opposition of his value. He is like, I don't care how it looks. I want it to work really well. When we were having this conversation, I was like, why are you applying for this kind of company in the first place? If you know functionality is your like top value when it comes to the kind of work that you do, you now need to go and look at companies where functionality is also really important to them. And then you are aligned and you are much more likely to have a smoother experience because you and the company care about the same things. It can just make how you make decisions easier, but also just align you better with things that are suited for you.
I understand his frustration, but I also like how you framed it, which is if you know this is their value, which is fine, it can be their value, but it doesn't align with where you are. You have to find a company that is going to balance both so that you are not annoyed and they achieve their goal of functional but beautiful design.
So another example, even if you think about tech companies, like Apple has a reputation for valuing privacy and secrecy. They always do these big secret reveals, right? And they are also private to their employees. They don't share as much information as a lot of other tech companies. For example, Google, transparency. And when I was at Meta, it was like a big thing as well. Like transparent communication was a high value for them. And so as an employee, you could expect that. Whereas if you're the kind of person who really values transparency from your leadership, you may struggle in an environment like Apple or like another company where the leadership are like, this is for us and we're not really sharing that information. So again, it gives you more clarity on what are the kinds of environments I'm most likely to thrive and most likely to be in alignment with the company culture and how decisions are made and all of those kinds of things.
I love the example you gave because for me, yes, transparency is one of those. I understand sometimes you have to make certain decisions, but then I want that information to flow and I want to know how it's going to affect me or what part you want me to have in it. But I will say that came over time, that maturation of thought, because early in my career I was like, we should know everything. And so how do you recommend people either hone or develop certain values like transparency, for example?
Our values 100% change over time and how we prioritize them as well changes over time. Because all of this conversation about values it's never binary. It's really just about ranking. It's about prioritization, right? And so in you choosing to prioritize and value something, you are at the same time are having to say, okay, I'm going to deprioritize something else. And that is always going to change depending on where you're at in your career, what's happening in your personal life. It's always going to evolve. Like what I prioritize and value now is different from 5 years ago, which is different from 10 years ago, even from a year ago, to be honest. So I think the key skill here is about continuous reflection. Even this initial exercise of what are my values right now and what do I want them to be moving forwards is an exercise that I encourage people to come back to at least every year, if not more regularly. But I would say that for me, I revisit it every year, but every quarter or when I'm doing my check-in, am I living aligned to my values? The question is, does this still make sense for who I am right now? Like maybe something has changed since the last time I did it. So I think having a practice of just like continuous reflection, continuously working to increase your self-awareness, it's never a completed project. And it does require some sacrifices.
Let's come back to that sacrifice.
Yeah.
I think that's a good one for people to understand early in their career. Can you expound on that a little bit just so people understand the perspective?
Yeah, I think the sacrifice really comes down to if you're going to prioritize something or some things, it is inherently going to come at the cost of other things. I'm finding it really interesting, this conversation around like Gen Z and like the kinds of boundaries and stuff that they have. And I think that part of that conversation is that I think a lot of other people, whether it's millennials or boomers, we can sometimes react to the things that they're prioritizing. But the fact that they're prioritizing is not inherently bad. I just think that there can sometimes be a disagreement around what are you prioritizing? And we can sometimes be judgmental about what they're choosing to prioritize because we often were like, we're going to prioritize progression and money and status and all of these kinds of things. And so when we see other people making other choices, it can be very triggering. But I think whatever the choices are, everybody is making sacrifices. And again, I think the more awareness you have, the earlier in your career you are, or the younger that you are, you can be intentional about what those sacrifices are. For example, I remember when I was earlier on in my career, one of the things that I consciously chose to prioritize was learning, even at the cost of leadership. I was in a situation at work where I knew I didn't have great leadership, but I felt like I know I'm going to learn so much, not necessarily from my leaders, but from the work I was doing. And so that's a trade-off I'm going to make. And then I reached a certain point where I was like, you know what? I feel like I've learned as much as I need from the content of my role. Now in my next opportunity, the thing I want to prioritize is leadership, because that is what I feel like at this next stage of my career. If I want to be a good leader, I need to be in proximity to great leadership, even if it comes at the trade-off of the actual role that I'm doing is not necessarily a big learning jump. Maybe it's similar to what I was doing before, or it's not the most exciting. If I'm working for an incredible leader, I'm willing to make that trade-off. So it's like those kinds of decisions where you have to know, what is it that I want to prioritize right now in my career? And I think that's going to mean different things to different people. For example, if you are earlier on in your career, you are more likely to have a lot of energy, right? So you could decide, you know what, I want to use that energy. I'm going to outwork everybody else at this stage of my career. Like I'm just going to put in the hours while I'm young. I don't have responsibilities. I'm just going to really focus on this. Or you could decide, you know what, at this stage, while I have all this energy, this is a perfect time for me to achieve some other goals in my life that require a lot of energy. Maybe I want to be an athlete on the side, or I want to travel. It's still up to you to decide essentially how you want to navigate those sacrifices.
A friend of mine, we were talking about being more strategic in your career. And I think being strategic in my career earlier was knowing what next move to make, and mapping this way towards leadership. But over time, it's adjusted. It was, I want to execute. And so that was my focus. And then over time, then the focus became, I want to help develop other people. So now I'm more into people leadership. I didn't realize it at the time, but I do think that's a much more empowering perspective, because I think people then start to think of their career as more of a journey versus I had to have it all mapped out. Base it on what's important to you right now. And you do have to get comfortable that your journey may not look the same as someone else's.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in that context, something that can often trip people up is as they're thinking about their values, or if you haven't yet thought about your values, you probably also haven't thought about what does success mean to you, because how you think about success is going to be connected to your values. So I think it's part of that whole conversation. It will force you to interrogate, what does success mean for me in my life as well as right now? I think it can be very challenging in the moment, especially when you're younger or you're early in your career and you don't have that perspective of having been working for a while. I think it can be really hard to anticipate the future. So it's hard to anticipate, like, where am I going to be or what am I going to want in 10 years' time in my career? And therefore, I should focus on these other things right now. Apart from the things which are sort of like society defined, right? Like maybe in the future, I know I want to have kids and therefore while I don't have kids, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. I think outside of those things, it can be hard to anticipate the future and therefore hard to make decisions. And so I think at this point, unless you interrogate your values and decide, this is who I am and this is the kind of person that I want to be. Because the whole point of your values that it's about how you think and therefore how you want to act in the world. And that's how we create our lives, right? Is through our actions. So always coming back to what kind of person do I want to be in this world and what kind of life do I want to live, and really grounding into what that means for you as opposed to what people around you or what you think you need to be doing in terms of like your life and your priorities. Because a lot of other people might not agree with your priorities. So you have to be able to feel like, actually, you know what? This is what feels right to me.
In another episode, we talk a lot about whether we call it the immigrant kid, first gen kids. It can be a clash of cultures. I've worked with people who come from very strong Nigerian background, or even for myself, just being Black American, like the family pressure to pursue a certain path, to pursue a certain career. I think reflecting on your values earlier helps you. I mean, it does create friction. But I think in what I hear you saying, if you spend that time investing in understanding your values, it's a lot easier to, or I would hope it makes it easier to communicate maybe some of the choices that you're making in your career right now.
Absolutely. And I think it can help you just understand why you've made certain choices, which gives you the clarity to make different choices. For example, I had a coaching client who had been at her job. She basically was still working at the same place that she had gone to right out of college, and it had been around 11 years by that point. And she was like, I hate it. I want to leave. I've known for years that I want to leave. I just don't know why I haven't left. And she kept saying, I think it's because of the security and that kind of thing. When we really looked into it in terms of interrogating her values around security, ultimately what it came down to was not security at all. It was about emotional safety, because she felt like if she left her job, her father would be disappointed in her. And once she understood that, and this has got nothing to do with her getting that particular check every month. And it's like, oh no, actually, I just don't want to let down my dad. That is something you can work with. Well, is that true at this age that my dad would be disappointed? Is it true that he would feel let down? Maybe he would feel differently now that I'm older. That understanding can just give you some clarity on, is this true for me still right now? And how can I move forward? It's a completely different solution than if you're thinking about it from a security lens. And that comes back to what I was saying, that even if you are not being conscious about your values, there's a subconscious value script running anyway. That's why it's in your best interest interrogating your values, choosing and being clear about them. Because if you don't do it, there's something happening anyway. And if your life doesn't look the way that you want it to, there's a big part of that might be because actually you're running a negative script. And when I say negative, I just mean like where you have unhealthy or unhelpful patterns. Like my client, your brain is still attached to this thing, which actually is not real in your life right now. So let's let it go and move forward and make different choices.
And I think the earlier you do that in your career, the more you can start to create the type of life that you really want. I know that seems a little bit overwhelming as a young person. So I think if you're starting with something, I won't say simple, but something as foundational as your values, I think that will help start to align your future. And again, things can change, you can reprioritize. But I think the earlier you do that, then you don't have to look back 10, 12, 14 years and say, oh, I haven't been happy for a long time, because you could have made different choices sooner.
One of the biggest predictors of job satisfaction and fulfillment is how much control and ownership that you feel. And I think the process of getting clear on your values and how you're prioritizing them can give you that sense of control and ownership. Because even if you decide, say you are early in your career and you decide, you know what, I am just going to grind it out for these next few years. I'm just going to do all the hours. I'm going to deprioritize balance. If you are intentionally making that choice that I am doing this because this is a value that I'm prioritizing right now, now in this season of my life, it's a more empowered place to be coming at that behavior from than just doing it because you feel like you have to in order to succeed, or because you feel like that's just what you're supposed to do, or you're getting pressure from your boss. And so you're just saying yes, which is more of like a passive reactionary response to a circumstance in comparison to like, no, you know what? I'm going to really just dedicate this time to this because it's going to serve this in my life. And I'm very clear about that. I think it's the same situation. You feel very differently about it and you are so much more in your power about it.
At some point, your values may collide with your work environment. And I do think you have to create healthy boundaries. I think the way that I'm envisioning that now through our conversation is changing a little bit. If we take the example of you grinding it out right now, in some ways, you probably need to create boundaries to make sure that you're not overextending yourself in that season. I tend to concentrate on the health of the decisions that you're making. And now that I'm much further in my career, I can see where sometimes I've allowed things to kind of wear me down if you're grinding it out. But now you're recognizing that this is no longer serving me. So if I'm starting to notice that friction or the priority of my values are starting to collide with my work environment, how do I start to pivot?
The question within the pivot is, for me at least, is this an opportunity for me to grow or do something different? Or is this actually a signal that it's time to go? Mm-hmm. So sometimes I think people are too quick to leave. Too quick to be like, this is not aligned and I'm out. And I think that sometimes people are too eager to stay. So I think it comes back to the level of awareness within your decision and your choice in terms of how you move forwards. The example that's coming to mind is I remember at Meta, the company decided to revamp some of their values. And when they announced the new values, I didn't think too much about it. But one of my colleagues, I remember, was really upset. And when we were talking about it, one of the values was be direct. They were like, we really want to focus on direct communication. And she was really upset. And she was like, I don't know what to do. She was from a culture where direct communication was considered disrespectful. And she was like, I've been raised my whole life not to be direct because that's rude. And now I'm being told that my ability to be direct is going to have an influence on how people perceive my performance. And it was really interesting because we had a conversation where she was essentially like, I either decide that this is not aligned for me and I'm going to move on to a different company where that more nuanced conversational style is there. Or she was like, you know what? I think this is an opportunity for me to learn to communicate in a different way. And I don't have to take it on as a new identity, but it's an opportunity for me to learn a new skill. And that is something I can kind of get my head around. And I think that's a really good example of like, you have to check in with yourself on what is the invitation here for me? What's the opportunity? What am I being asked to do? Mm-hmm. I think it comes back to that awareness that you're being flexible, but true to your values at this point. And again, it comes back to the prioritization. Is this something that I want to continue to prioritize right now? Or actually, am I willing to make a trade-off in exchange for something else? So in that example, she was essentially choosing to prioritize learning instead. And that was an intentional decision. So again, you have to decide, okay, what is my trade-off here going to be? And is it worth it? Is it what I want?
How do you manage? And even how do you recognize when you're being stretched and challenged? Like I said, some of my values have changed. I call it a maturation process, but it's because they were challenged and it made me reflect and it pushed me to learn. So for example, transparency, I had a completely different perspective in the early part of my career than I do now. I recognize how sharing information too soon can have an impact or withholding it too tightly can have an impact. But it was because I was stretched and I had to go back and reflect and see, okay, is this an opportunity for me to learn how things work in a different way? Or is this cause for me to separate? And then I think the other piece is you make me reflect on my career journey. Like for me, I'm a person of faith. I feel like God has never allowed me to leave a place. And I've moved around a lot in my career. If you look at my LinkedIn, I'm not afraid to move. But I always felt like I wasn't able to be released from an environment until I got clarity on it. There's always that initial upset or again, that friction that occurs. But for me, I had to get a clear understanding of why is this not working for me? Because otherwise I would have just walked into the same situation, just in a different location. I had to get to that point where like I could name the thing and then make a tangible decision. Because when I was just fussing and complaining, it felt like I was just being held there. It's like, okay, you can whine about it, but what's the real problem? And until I spent that time getting to the real or the root of the issue, which now I realize in some ways was a reprioritization of my values.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It reminds me, my coach always used to say to me, graduate, don't repeat. Because I would if I was saying to her, I just want to leave, or I just want to get out of this experience or get out of this project or leave this company. She's like, okay, but you're just going to repeat the same pattern somewhere else. So why don't we graduate from this? It's until you're able to get to that point of I've learned my lesson. I'm ready to graduate from this and then move on to another one. Not being able to be released from that. I think it makes a lot of sense because I think even sometimes when our values are colliding with our environment or situations, I've also noticed in my career, those have been really good inflection points that have pushed me to reprioritize my values and to be oh, I'm actually valuing and prioritizing something that no longer serves me. Maybe it used to. So for example, I used to work too much, basically. I guess I was kind of a grinded out girl. I was working to way too many hours and took a lot of pride in my work ethic and really valued hard work. And it was through working with my coach where I realized that this thing that I'm valuing does not serve me. I think it's serving the people around me. But a lot of it, to be honest, when I went underneath it, I was this is about approval. I'm trying to get that sense of approval and belonging. When I thought about it from that perspective, I was I don't want approval to be a top value for me. So why am I behaving like it? And so, yeah, that really pushed me to be actually, I'm going to reprioritize and focus on something else. So I do think those challenging moments can be a really powerful invitation to reorganize your priorities, to mature on a value.
I like that because in this day and age, a lot more of us are in therapy and processing past traumas and all of that. And I know this is career focused, but I think when those things come up, seeking approval, people pleasing, any of that, I find it's hard for me to connect that in my life. I probably don't see myself as a people pleaser, but I think if I examine the decisions that I'm making, if I examine what I'm valuing, it's tangible for me to make a change. So I think in the way that you're examining that and what you connected it to allowed you to figure out your reprioritization. If you are grinding it out right now, that's okay. Understand the why behind it and approach it in a healthy way. But if you start to see it taking a toll on the other things that are important to you, whether it be your health, your family, your friendships, then you can reprioritize.
Absolutely. Even with what you're saying about therapy and everything, and even though it's work, I can tell you that I have not had a single client where when we got to the root of the issues that they had with work, that they were not related to their family, their childhood, the things that you would think are outside of work or you would think about or you talk about in therapy because of your relationships. It's all connected because ultimately we are still our human being selves in our work context. We are still having to relate to other people and all of your relationship dynamics. It doesn't matter whether the people are your friends, your family, your work colleagues or anything like that. Your dynamics are going to be the same. I remember reading somewhere about how even your relationships that you have with your managers often mirror the relationships that you've had with caregivers in the past. Essentially, it's all relationships. And so it's all going to be connected to the things that inform our relationships. And a lot of our values and all of our imprinting comes from our childhood and our family context as we're growing up. So absolutely, it's going to affect your work. And like you said, the kinds of careers we choose to go into, our beliefs around success, all of that, it's all connected.
There were so many drop the mic moments for me in my conversation with Kiran. Looking at my values as a mental model for my behavior is a connection that I just never considered. When I reflect on some of my earlier career choices, I can definitely say there were a few that left me wishing I had invested time in defining my own value script. The point of defining your values is to build that self-awareness muscle that will help you navigate your career from the very beginning. Ain't nobody got time for burnout. We're trying to avoid these quarter life, third quarter, and midlife crises. And if you're there right now, in addition to therapy, nurturing yourself and treatment, spend some time reflecting on your values and what's most important to you in this season. Knowing your values can help you make more empowered decisions in the roles you pursue, in the organizations you align with, in recognizing when you're holding yourself back from growth opportunities, and in overcoming that stuck feeling when it's time to transition. Consistently reviewing your values can help you clarify your goals so that you're not repeating the same misalignments over and over and over again. Like Kiran's therapist said, graduate, don't repeat. It's not a one and done. Your values are going to change over time, and that's okay. Girl, make this career an adventure. Life is going to life. Work is going to work, but don't wait for discontent, exhaustion, or burnout to figure out how you need to prioritize your values and goals. As we closed out our conversation, I asked Kiran to share her recommendations for early career transitioning Black women who want to start this process of exploring and defining their values.
Yeah, I think that any kind of reflective practice, I would say that that is the most important thing, like getting into a consistent reflective practice, whether that's like journaling every morning or maybe weekly or even monthly, even quarterly, just like as regularly as you can take some time to examine your thoughts, examine your behavior, come to some clarity and make some decisions on, is this how I want to be living my life? I think that would be my number one starting point. And then from there, you can use different resources as your points of inquiry. So whether it's a book or it's an exercise or something, ultimately, it's still the same reflective exercise of examining your thoughts. I think some books that I've found really helpful, I can't remember the name of the author, but the book is called Designing Your Life. And I love that because it helps you to think about your career and your decisions from an experimentation perspective. So kind of thinking about it, which I think gives more flexibility and again, prioritizes your values. So thinking about it from a values first perspective. The yearning octopus exercise that I shared, I think is really valuable, even if it's early on, to work with someone, whether it's a therapist or a coach, or even if it's a friend where you're able to share what has come up for you and they can ask you clarifying questions. So you can even say, hey, I don't want advice, but just, can you ask me some questions that come up for you related to what I've said? Things that are going to force your reflection to go a bit deeper than if it's just you by yourself. I think those are the things that I would recommend for people to get started. But ultimately, it comes down to raising your awareness on these patterns and so that you can make clearer decisions moving forwards.
Kiran, thank you so much. I knew this conversation would be amazing, but this has been so enlightening for me. And I just thank you for your time and for joining us.
No, I'm so glad. It was such a fun exploration. So yeah, thank you so much for inviting me and for being in this conversation with me.
I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Take some time to reflect on what you heard here. Be sure to follow us on IG and subscribe to our newsletter on Substack. Find us at Thriving in the Game on both. If you have a comment or recommendation, DM or email me. You can find my email in the show notes. I'd love to hear from you as we build community around thriving in the game. Until next time, take care.